Good morning, everyone in U.S. History 2. We're on Chapter 19. I believe it's roughly the fourth chapter in U.S. History 2. And it's talking about American Empire. I think I say this about every chapter, very important chapter. It's a chapter which I like because it involves sort of a stretching of manifest destiny beyond going from East Coast to West Coast and thinking of what we think of today as the continent of the United States. Now it's going beyond those borders and we're becoming a player in world affairs. And we get involved in those things, some largely economically, but later it's also this concept of manifest destiny where we believe that our form of Republican democracy, our values, our American character is superior to that of other portions of the world. And when we either liberate other countries, we substitute the liberation of the oppressor for our own really oppression. I mean, we often think we're doing it for the right reasons, both in terms of cultural, religious, technological, and our sense of our superiority in terms of our governmental structure. It is nonetheless a substitution of one dominant imperialist power for another in these different forms. So it's a mixed concept, American imperialism, and most people think of it as very negatively. I do as well. But there has to be fairness in when we look at history. History is complex. And part of the imperialistic measures and events that occur are not always damning to the foreign nations. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but when we get to Cuba, for example, Cuba was under a very, very brutal regime of the Spanish, and they were pushing for independence from Spain, and we helped with that process. Arguably, the unfortunate part is then we controlled Cuba on a significant level until we were satisfied with the nature of the government that was developed there, and our business interests were satisfied and protected on a certain level. So it's a double-edged sword. I don't want you to think all the time that all of our ventures throughout the world during this era, the industrialization era of America, the Gilded Age, where we're wealthy, we're getting stronger militarily, we're getting very strong economically, that the push into foreign countries wasn't always designed for evil. We actually, I'm saying we in the United States, in that era actually believed we were bringing civilization to some of these regions and we were benefiting them. But we know the history is mixed, and obviously there was some oppression. Much of it was for business people, for their economic security and attainment in these foreign countries. And some of it was a bit brutal, and we were often unwelcomed, and we wouldn't leave voluntarily from these areas. I'm thinking of the Philippines, which we initially were welcome when we helped the Philippines basically throw the yoke off of Spain. We later become arguably oppressors of the Philippine people because they wanted their pure independence, but we thought their pure independence was too radical, so we basically forced our hands into the Philippine Islands for a period of time. But what I'm trying to say is it's not just imperialism is bad, it's evil. I'm like, yes, but why did some of it occur is a little bit more complex and sometimes not always with an evil heart or evil intention. It starts off with the introduction of the American Empire, that with all this great wealth, many of the other European powers were already well engaged in colonization of foreign lands as well as imperialistic control of other foreign territories, and part of it was a sort of a competition among the elite nations of the world, the most civilized, the wealthiest, and the most powerful. It almost felt like an outreach of the view of their own superiority. It's part of that philosophical outlook that is the foundation of almost every nation's nationalism. We're mighty and we're right, and we're going to prove it by domination. But anyways, I regress. I said it about 3 times. All right. So patterns of American insurrection. We know initially in China, the open door policy wasn't necessarily oppressive. It was basically saying all the Western powers that were over there seeking trade, seeking financial success, it should be done through a voluntary basis, and no one country should ever militaristically or economically become dominant in that region. And so the open door policy under John Hay, which is pretty famous, you probably heard the term before, maybe you don't know what it means until now, probably studied it in high school, but it was called for all Western powers to have equal access to Chinese markets. And no Western power, or the combination of all of them, shouldn't dominate the Chinese people. It should be sort of a free and arm's length transaction, let's hope. We know that deteriorates, though, quite a bit because there are Chinese citizens that feel that Western incursion, especially missionaries, religious dogma being sort of, lack of a better word, inculcated into the Chinese culture, was resented by many of them, including foreign trade. Foreign trade was looked at as negatively by many of the Chinese, and it ultimately led to a revolt, and that's called the Boxer Rebellion. And we know that President McKinley at the time did not seek congressional consent, but sent military forces over to China to crush the Boxer Rebellion. Other European powers did as well too, and there were some atrocities, arguably, on the side of some of the rebellious Chinese as well. But they're trying to basically push out what they see as too much Western influence and control in their homeland. But the open door policy on its face sounded, I think, arguably very reasonable, but the Boxer Rebellion was to push out Western influence and Western businesses, and it was crushed in large part by the military forces that were sent by President McKinley. And one of the most important things I think the book stresses, and I wish it was almost like a separate section, says President McKinley sent U.S. Army without consulting Congress, setting a precedent for U.S. presidents to order American troops and actions around the world under executive powers. This was the beginning of that process. And if you look at throughout history, we've only declared war as recently as World War II is the last time Congress actually declared war. Presidents have historically been given a greater degree of latitude in entering phrase to protect the national interests in the heat of the moment, and only later could basically Congress pull that back through the budgeting process. We recognize as commander-in-chief that the presidents often have to act quickly. They usually try to consult with Congress, but we know that there's a historical precedent since McKinley to recognize that presidents have the ability, at least initially, to enter into armed conflict without necessarily the consent of Congress, even though the Constitution seems to bar that. So the Boxer Rebellion, a movement that was opposed to foreign businesses and missionaries operating in China, it wasn't just against the United States, it was against all the European powers, and we know it gets crushed by the European powers. And when anything gets crushed, it's doing what? It's basically taking away the autonomy of the home nation. So there's the negative aspect of the open door policy. I mean, it wasn't the Boxer Rebellion was a distinct aspect of what happened after the open door policy. I think the open door policy started with an altruistic, inappropriate sort of mentality, but the Chinese people had enough of the incursion of Western ways, religion, and business practices that seemed like it was dominating their society, and there was a pushback. And that today, I think today, to this day, it's still celebrated in China, the Boxer Rebellion of 1898. We know that we also took territory that wasn't necessarily occupied or occupied in any significant way. The first one, the book, and I love the title, the Guano Islands Act, or territories. And guano means bird excrement, and those islands were seized in the Pacific on behalf of the United States, not to become a state, not to become specifically a territory, but basically an interest that we control. And why would we want these islands that seem useless other than the fact that they contained a lot of guano? Well, guano was actually very important to the agricultural industry in the United States, and business people wanted to have access and cheap access to the soil, which was made up largely of guano, and it was used as a fertilizer for big commercial agricultural interests. Yeah, that was all the way back in 1856. And we know Hawaii, merchants and business people started getting involved in the early 1800s into Hawaii. I think it's 1820. And we know they bring missionaries and business people, and eventually 5 oligarchies, 5 major families control the sugar industry in Hawaii, basically control the island, and they try to control the monarchy, the autonomy of Hawaii for a period of time, and we know eventually that's going to backfire, and eventually the military is going to crush the Hawaiian monarchy and any other basically self-autonomy, and it's going to be controlled by the American government henceforth. And it's based upon what? Is it based upon the fact that these people are barbaric or these people are inappropriate? No, it's based upon this manifest destiny that our business interests need to be protected. So a lot of it's economics, always the mighty dollar behind some of this stuff. But part of it was also the sense that we know better. We know better for these people, and we should therefore control them. And that's what does happen. And then Latin America, we know about. We've had the Monroe Doctrine since President Monroe. President Monroe was the 5th president. And the Monroe Doctrine was basically telling all European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, unless you're already here. No new colonization would be allowed. Any risk to the Western Hemisphere by new European incursions would be thought of as an act of war against us. We still hold the Monroe Doctrine as viable today. It's just a principle. I don't know why people think we have the right to do that, but we did. And then we know after McKinley gets assassinated, in comes in Teddy Roosevelt, one of the most expansionist presidents we ever had in history. he creates something called a corollary to it, and that's adding to the Monroe Doctrine. And he says not only do we have the right to basically expel or deter other European powers from the Western Hemisphere, we have an obligation to interfere in different countries in the Western Hemisphere if it risks our business interests or if we deem it's basically a violation of Western civilized code in some way. We have the ability and the right to interfere with it, and basically the rest of the world take note of that. And that's also sometimes the philosophy, the quote he used to always be famous for was, speak softly but carry a big stick. We'll gladly work with all these foreign countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, but if we think you're impeding upon our property interests that we have in your nation, or business interest, and we think there is a just cause, we should be able to interfere with that through might, if not just dollar diplomacy. What's dollar diplomacy? That's basically helping control governments to our favor through monetary, well, if you want to look at it coldly, through bribery. But foreign countries can also be basically influenced also by an infusion of American dollars, often would basically take these governments to be, even if they were barbaric to their own people, as long as they were beneficial to American interests, we'd often support them. So it was both through military force, which is the big stick policy, but it's also through dollar diplomacy. I don't know if I referenced it in earlier chapters or it's going to come up in later chapters, but dollar diplomacy is still exercised by America to this day, or the United States to this day, is this sense of sponsoring or helping foreign nations through economic stimulus and support. We get allegiances and we get protection of our business interests in those countries. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because some of the countries that we do it with aren't exactly, known for their civil liberties to their citizens and civil rights for their citizens. So it's a complicated question. But dollar diplomacy is the financial investment in these foreign countries. And we know the big stick policy is basically, if you don't comply, we're going to come in there. And we have many times. And we know Mexico is part of it. Mexico is finally going to throw off the yoke of Spain. And that's in 1910. They throw Spain out. They're now an independent country. We're fairly happy with them initially. But there's American investment that gets concerning. The U.S. government tried to control events and politics in Mexico after the Civil War against Spain, but it couldn't do so. But then a strong man came in, took over from the revolutionary leader known as Porfirio Diaz in 1910. Now it's in 1913, Victoriano Huerta. He basically takes over the country. We object vigorously. We demanded that he step aside and let free elections take place. He basically ignores us. But then we're just waiting for, we hadn't had in the Vietnam War. Usually we look for some kind of catalyst or an event to draw us in to justify our incursion into Mexico. Business people are pushing for it. Newspapers are pushing for it. There's a real war whip, a cry to attack Mexico because of this basically strongman taking over from a legitimate revolution. And then in 1914, it's April 1914, basically some military force of Mexico captures some American sailors in the city of Tampico. They try to make amends for it. They realize it was a mistake, but they couldn't come to any kind of resolution. Wilson asked for Congress to declare war against Mexico. But even before Congress even responds, again, McKinley already started this process. Wilson invaded and took the port city of Veracruz. And his argument was he had to do it and act immediately because there was a German shipment of arms that were coming into Mexico, and that would hurt our ability to fend off any further conflict with that country. So the Huerta government fell in 1914, but this is one of the interesting things. This gentleman named Carranza comes into power, and President Wilson, the American people throw our support behind Carranza, but he had a more radical, liberal competitor for power, and that was the famous Pancho Villa. And Villa had several hundred supporters, attacked American interests, and raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico. He comes into basically what we think of continental U.S. soil. And several dozen soldiers and civilians were killed, and that's it. And that broke the back. And Wilson ordered a punitive expedition of several thousand soldiers, led by later war hero from World War I, John Blackjack Pershing, to enter North Mexico and capture Villa. But Villa eluded Persia for nearly a year. And then the war breaks out in Europe in 1970, and Pancho Villa was a thorn in our back for a long time. And there was a lot of art and history that would often reference back in the era about Pancho Villa being this sort of this rebel leader of Mexico that we couldn't subdue or crush. And he still lives in sort of popular nostalgic history for the Mexican people against, basically Americans trying to intervene into what they shouldn't have any right to do so. So the United States' actions during the Mexican Revolution reflected its long-standing policy that justified interventionist actions in Latin America because of their potential bearing on the United States, whether it was a shared border, but most significantly, economic. It's always going to be economic. If we don't have that much economic interest, we often might look the other way to some of these people trying to throw off the yoke of Spain and saying that, we have a duty to help liberate these people for democracy. It becomes a much more viable argument, much more salient to the American people if there's money involved. And obviously, geography makes important. Mexico's a border and country, of course, that's different. That's why we didn't get involved nearly as much in the Middle East during this era. And I love the fact that they take a moment to reflect on Mark Twain's visit. When did he go over? In 1868, he went to the Middle East and he wrote a book about his travels there called The Innocents Abroad. And he said, he basically said, the people, they all stared at us at everywhere we went, and we all stared at them. We generally made them feel rather small, too, because we got done with them because we bore down on them with America's greatness until we crushed them. And we don't invade over there for any specific reason until much later. But when we do go into the Middle East, we do go so with a superiority complex. We think we're superior to the backwater. No, there's not much water, but backwoods or ignorant Middle East, and we are a superior people to them. But again, the military and the government had very little interest in the Middle East at this time. Our interests were between the Middle East were interesting. It was actually prior to World War I, came not in the form of trade, but in education, science, and humanitarian aid. Protestant missionaries went over in 1819. The Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the Reformed Church of America, they all went over to the Middle East during this time and established colleges that still exist to this day in that area, hospitals and schools and things like that. Pretty interesting. We'll get involved much later in the Middle East in this class. This is U.S. history too, and we know the Middle East is really going to explode after World War II. But we'll get to that. 1898, we know the Spanish-American War. It's called the Spanish-American War. We think it would be about Mexico, but it's not. It's about Cuba. And we know there's tensions rising there, mostly because of our financial interest in that country. The Cuban people are trying to revolt against Spain, and there are newspapers and propagandists that are in this country saying we've got to help the Cuban people based upon a humanitarian level, if nothing else. I think the almighty dollar was also pushing for it. And they had a civil war, and they were basically trying to throw off the yoke of the Spanish government. And as tensions kept starting to rise, I was going to call him governor, but President McKinley sends in the Maine, which is a battleship, into the cove outside of Havana. And it explodes and sinks. And to this day, I think there's some debates about whether it was an internal explosion. I think there's some evidence that it might have been, meaning something within the ship itself exploded. The armaments were a little bit different then. We don't really know for sure, but there's the trigger point. Just like those soldiers and sailors that got captured in Tampico, Mexico. This is what happens. The Maine gets sank, and people in newspapers were hollering, "Remember the Maine, remember the Maine," giving us our justification for going there. And we know as a result of that, we are going to go to war in Cuba. They were called yellow journalists back then in his newspaper. I would carry these sensational stories of Spanish atrocities to the Cuban people, as well as the sinking of the Maine, really pushed for war. Initially, there wasn't. Spain's hold on Cuba at this point was very tenuous, but one of the more famous stories that come out of it is Theodore Roosevelt was then, I think, the undersecretary of the Navy. He resigns because he wants to go into military service, and there was a really ragtag different group of military adventurers that went into Cuba, and he went with a group called the Rough Riders, basically kind of cowboyish type people, and they really glamorized war against the Spanish in Cuba, and he rode up San Juan Hill, and he was very brave. There's no question about it. Don't think he was shot or wounded, but he went up there, and there's no question that Theodore Roosevelt definitely threw caution to the wind in battle, and he romanticized about it until his own son dies later in war. But they went in there, and they took over And at what point was this? Yeah, the terms of the treaty. This was interesting. So, as a result of basically the Spain not being able to hold on to Cuba as a result of American forces invading in 1898, we know that the treaty was signed in Paris, and it would not only give us or relinquish control to Cuba, which we gave back to Cuba to run on its own as long as it was agreeable to our business interest and our sense of democracy. But it goes on and it gives us the holdings of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And the Philippines are a huge archipelago of islands. It's massive. Um, and we know that at that time, the Philippine people were already revolting against Spanish rule anyways. Unfortunately, once we take control of it, we don't just let it go to the Spanish people. The Spanish people have to revolt against us, and there's a long simmering internal strife of what we consider to be revolutionary, radical, terrorists, but they are the Philippine people. Um, and so there's this concept of empire building at this time. And I love the photograph or this little cartoon that was depicted during this era of the different countries before we went in and how they were, the Spanish oppression in the Philippines, industrial slavery in Hawaii, Puerto Rico and Cuba was under Spanish yoke, and then of course, the Isthmus of Panama we have to take away from um, uh, foreign interests as well too, so we can build the Panama Canal. But then they show those same countries after the United States gets involved and frees them, and now they're suddenly able to stand upright and they look like well-groomed Middle Americans because we gave them better forms of self-government and or economic viability. There's a bit of a Pollyannish narrow view, but there's no question that we saw it that way. Um, there's other great cartoons in there about this whole expansionist view. Um, and there were groups, don't forget, even in that era, there were groups that were anti-expansionists and thought it was really repugnant and inappropriate for us to be involved in these foreign affairs. But they're the quieter voices. They're the lesser. The majority of Americans like to be in world affairs as long as their kids weren't getting killed. But if we could dominate them through either dollar diplomacy or just outright control, it was seen very favorably. It was the part of this manifest destiny. McKinley's assassination. Now Theodore Roosevelt is in charge, and you should know for test purposes and just for common sense is that the corollary of Roosevelt to the Monroe Doctrine is not only that Western powers or European powers have to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but we also can invade or intervene in any Western Hemisphere country that we deem is unstable or violent to its own people or a threat to our economic well-being or the well-being of the people within the community. Basically, it's this license to basically be the police power of the Western Hemisphere. And it was very popular in Truman. Theodore Roosevelt in his own time was very, very popular. There's no question about it. One of the most powerful presidents we've ever had in history. Like him or hate him, he certainly did. And he didn't believe it in an evil way. I don't think Theodore Roosevelt was an evil man. But in hindsight, we can often look back and say it's really inappropriate to have this kind of imperialistic outlook. But in his time, he was looking at it as a sort of superior American who was going to bring liberty and a better form of government and order to these other parts of the world, and we were doing it out of a sort of a Christian set of values and Western values that were absent and or not yet introduced into these regions. So you kind of have to sometimes look at it in context and not just say it's always pure evil. Yeah, so we went to Latin America in order to correct administrative and fiscal deficiencies. We're doing it for them. And there's some truth to it. It's not entirely a lie, but it's like once we help them, we don't just walk away all the time. We often stay there as long as it benefits our business investments and our country's national security. Yeah, dollar diplomacy. Even George Washington, all the way back, worked with bankers to provide loans to Latin American nations in exchange for some level of control over their fiscal affairs. That's dollar diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy, we know that is military versus the dollar diplomacy. Either way, it was to get what? It was to get a certain degree of control in foreign nations. Yeah, it says creditors that could not force settlements of loans until they successfully lobbied their governments to get involved and forcibly collect debts. So, and he got, in Roosevelt's a mixed bag. He actually got, because it was a foreign conflict that was concerning, it was between Russia and Japan. He basically brought him over to the United States to sit down and try to come to a peace treaty, and he did. And that peace treaty between Russia and Japanese, he got him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. So not all of the foreign dealings that Roosevelt and our nation, it's not just Roosevelt, our whole country was supportive of these, most of the country was supportive of these incursions into other parts of the world, were not always done with evil intent. Sometimes it was to keep the peace on some level, because the peace would benefit us, of course. Women in imperialism, and I love the sort of the allegory or the metaphor of this woman that was brought about to just advertise the prepackaged Heinz products that existed at that time. And she was projecting an image of middle-class American domesticity, of pure womanhood. Heinz saw itself not only as providing economical and healthy foodstuff, it was bringing the blessings of civilization to the world. And this woman would travel around with Heinz corporate people and basically showing their products to the world. But they're also showing off this woman as to what it was like to be a superior westernized female identity. And women supported it generally the same way as men did. And, there were some objections to it. There's no question about it. Only Europeans and Americans had attained the highest level of civilization, which was superficially marked by whiteness, but also included an industrial economy and a gender division in which men and women had diverging but complementary roles. We saw our society as superior. That's the bottom line. Very jingoistic, very, very biased viewpoint, but arguably to this day, don't most people think, wherever they live, that they've got the best answers and they've got the best thing? We like to think we're more thoughtful than that, but sometimes we do, right? Part of it is a nationalist view we have. So the U.S. imperialism, both as symbols of the benefit of American society and as vehicles for the transition of American values. Many white women felt that they had a duty to spread the benefits of Christian civilization to those less fortunate of them. It's not an evil thought, but in hindsight it looks very narrow-minded, but then it wasn't. And Ida B. Wells, this is the same woman that wrote the book about the lynchings in the South, where over 5,000 lynchings occurred between, I think it's 1870 and 1920. I think that's the era she looked at, where all these extra legal, no due process, no fairness of lynchings of African Americans, not just males, but females too, that were thought to have maybe committed a crime or done something inappropriate. Often not, but that was the underlying justification for it. She wrote that book, but she also was a part of a campaigner for the anti-imperialism, because it was just that. It was taking away the liberties of others and supplementing our own view about what's best for them. Paternalism is negative in her mind, but the majority of us thought it was okay. Immigration, this is interesting. Huge immigration during this era. It was covered in the last chapter. Immigration is booming. Up until this era, we basically had an open door policy. Anybody can, as long as they had the money and the ability to get over here, they're welcome aboard. They can come on. But we know most of the immigration earlier on was Western Europe. The Scots, the Irish, German, English. Those were the initial immigrants. But now the immigration is evolving to more Southern European, Asia, and Eastern European, and these people often don't speak English. They are of a different color, a different racial outlook, and they are often viewed negatively by the nativists, meaning those who are already here, which is ironic because they're obviously the children or grandchildren, or maybe they themselves are immigrants themselves, but they look at it with a very jaundiced eye, very negative view of the new recent immigrants from these new regions of the country. But they're coming in huge numbers, especially in the cities. It's massive. Industrialization, imperialism, and immigration, they're all linked. Yeah, here it is. Between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. And now here's what's interesting here, just to be clear. The migration was largely a continuation of a process begun before the Civil War, though by the turn of the 20th century, new groups such as Italian, Poles, Eastern European Jews made up a larger percentage of the arrivals, while Irish and German numbers began to dwindle. It was a changing nature of who these people were. Obviously, if they're Jewish, they're not Catholic, but many of these were Catholic groups, and America was identified significantly as Protestant. So there was a real disdain for the immigration that were coming in, including the Chinese. And there was a huge anti-Chinese movement in the western part of our nation. And the first legal impediment um, to uh, to the Chinese was the very first act, and I can't remember the name off the top. I think it was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Basically, see, I was in the 1870s. Looking for the specific date of the the Caucasian race. 1882. Prior to that, there was a few acts banning people that had mental health issues, disease, criminals. Most of us can. Well, I don't think the mental illness one is so good, but I could see, you don't want people coming over with communicable diseases. You don't want people coming over that are necessarily violent criminals. The mental illness one, I think, is a bit tragic, but it was finally in 1882, Congress suspended immigration of all Chinese laborers with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it was called very much that. They were the first group to specifically be identified based upon their ethnicity or race, because the tension over in the West was significant, especially after the railroads were getting near completion. These Chinese laborers were competing for jobs with other Caucasians, and it's sometimes it's driven by economics, but it's also driven by you're different. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first group to be banned. We know there's another one that's on a law or a treaty. It's called the Gentleman's Agreement. That was with Japan. I believe that was set in 1907, and that was basically a gentleman's agreement between Theodore Roosevelt and the leaders of the Japanese Empire at the time, that no more Japanese would come over to be laborers. And then the big one in August of 1882 is also Congress passed an Immigration Act denying admission to people who were not able to support themselves. No more poor, no more wretched. You've got to come over. You've got to be able to have a certain degree of wealth. And no paupers, people with mental illness or convicted criminals might otherwise threaten the security of the nation. Poor people come over. They're going to become wards of the state. They're going to be financially burdensome to the American people, and that's unfair. So we're going to ban them. It sounds very recent, doesn't it? That's still part of our philosophy to this day, that we can only take in so many, or not us, all of us. I'm just saying, as our government has an immigration policy that is concerned with not overburdening the resources of the American society. Because, as my father would say, if everybody would come to America, everybody would, it would get off tilted on its axis. I think he's exaggerating it, because there's other countries that do quite well and are quite pleasant to live in, but there are many countries where people are struggling for food and shelter and freedom, and so the draw of America is still very, very big. But we can't. The argument is on the other side of the coin, can't just let everybody in. So some of these acts. So the center of immigrant sending regions shifted from northern and western Europe to southern and eastern. That changes the view. And again, the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, according to Japanese, would stop issuing passports to working class immigrants, but that pretty much ended Japanese immigration at this time. So as a result, Catholics in America face two intertwined challenges, one external related to Protestant anti-Catholicism, the other internal having to do with challenges of assimilation. And I don't know about you, but there's an piece of artwork. I've always taught that we're a melting pot. We all come over and we kind of lose that identity when we're an immigrant, whether we're from Ireland, Germany, France, China, Japan, Africa. If you're from all these different, you become a melting pot and you sort of meld and you turn into an American and you lose some of that identity. But what identity you keep is only in the superficial realm. I think that's been largely disputed, especially in this era. Immigrants tended to do what? Because they were often shunned by people who were here, the nativists, they often disliked immigrants. Immigrants found homes near other immigrants that spoke like them, that maybe practiced the same religion, that had the same skin color. And that's partially true to some degree to this day. I know I grew up in an area of Springfield, Mass, called Hungry Hill. It was largely, I don't know how many blocks or how many square miles, was significantly an Irish community. My father used to tell me about the history, and I studied a little bit of Springfield history. There were neighborhoods. The South End was largely Italian when I was, maybe before I was a kid, I'm saying 1950s, was largely Italian. The North End was mostly French, later becoming mostly Spanish immigrants from Puerto Rico. And the Forest Park section was more of the Protestant, Long Meadow. It's just a very interesting dichotomy of the different neighborhoods you raise. So it wasn't really a true melting pot. And African Americans occupied a neighborhood called the Pine Point in the Hill McKnight section. It wasn't because there were laws saying you had to live in these areas, but people because of distrust of other people and because of not always being welcomed with an open doormat to our nation, we're not truly a melting pot. I think it's a mix. I think there are times where there is assimilation, and I think it's a beautiful thing. But I think times also people tend to gravitate towards people who are like them because of a feeling of security and safety. But it's interesting how we were often taught through sort of propaganda that we're a melting pot and we're all sort of together and we all become Americanized. It's not always necessarily true. And I don't know if I talked about in this class before, but my father, who was kind of an eccentric character, you're curious about who you are, right? When you're growing up, am I Irish, am I German? I'm very mongrelized. I'm many different nationalities, but people tell me I have the face of Ireland. I look like an Irish person significantly. So I used to tell my dad, I said, Dad, I'm Irish, right? Or we're Irish. And he would always come back to me and says, no, you just look a little different. You're a little off. And he goes, because you're not quite right. So that's why you look Irish. He'd make fun of Irish people, basically, even though we were predominantly Irish. And the reason why you did that, and talking to him later when I was an adult, is, why'd you always say that? You always kind of, seem to deter me from having an identity as an Irish kid or a German kid or French or Scottish or English, all these other things I was made up of. He goes, I want you to be American. He really believed in the melting pot thing. He really wanted me to identify as an American and not as an Irish person and not as an English person and stuff like that. So there's some degree of truth that there is an assimilation process in the history of America, and many of us do identify more with being American than whatever our DNA says we're from. But boy, in this early period of time, it wasn't always so easy to assimilate. And people were often put into these very ethnic neighborhoods, both by design, not overt laws, but let's face it, it was hard to break into other neighborhoods either because of financial restrictions or because of your own feeling of safety and comfort. You want to live in the communities where you felt like people were of a like-mindedness. And then the Catholic Church talks, I think it's really interesting about how the Catholic Church itself was divided because they would start creating churches based upon a Polish church. The Greeks are a different kind of, the Christianity, Greeks are somewhat different. Not to get into all the religious stuff, but there were French churches, there were the Irish neighborhood churches, there were the Polish churches, and it was really troublesome to the Pope and say, no, we're one church and that's it. And they were trying to deter us from opening up those kinds of churches. But as a kid, one of my best friends is he's dead, and his picture's behind me, but his mother just died, but his brother would call me, say, hey, my mom died. I said, where's the funeral? He goes, over the Polish church in Webster. There's still this identity with some of these communities that relate to the ethnicity of them, but supposedly all Catholic dogma is the same, right? But you see how the assimilation wasn't always so pure and so easy. So tension between Catholicism and American life, however, would continue well into the 20th century. I think there's some argument still exists to this day that we have these different churches made up of different ethnic Catholics, even though the Catholic dogma is all the same, or the teachings are supposedly all the same and universal. I just find this interesting history because I'm a big political buff, and politicians to this day sometimes struggle to find support and or not rejection based upon their religious views and their ethnicity and we didn't even get into sexism. It was alive and well during this era. Women don't even get the right to vote until 1920. But it's an interesting chapter. It's about imperialism. It's about our growth beyond our boundaries, and we become a world power. We know that because we're about to segue into World War II reluctantly. World War I, pardon. But other than that, hopefully that's somewhat a decent review of this chapter. I think it's a very well-written book. Enjoy it. I only test from the book. So if you have any questions, concerns, don't be afraid to shoot me an email. Otherwise, be well.